changing the gallery, finding new people and putting it all together. We love it. That week where the work comes in and we set it up and we open, those are the best weeks. They're great. That's what we really love that. Finding people, showing people, hearing the feedback is brilliant.
It's funny because I often try to think about where it all started really, and it's a difficult one because you pursue a particular path in your career and you end up in a place that you could never have imagined being, and you don't ever consider how you got there or where it started. And I think probably a lot of the early influences I had really shaped my interest. I used to go to a sugar craft class with my mum when I was a kid. My dad was away in the military a lot, so my mum was sort of my primary carer really, and I used to just get taken along wherever she went, in a good way, because she was always doing interesting things. She was very into the outside world and we did a lot of walking, and she was interested in crafts and making things. I mean, she came from a reasonably poor background in North Wales and they knitted their own clothes. They had no electricity, no running water, so my mum's always had a make do and mend side to her really. And I think that's sort of passed on to me. Making's always been important. And actually, when I look at my dad's family, his granddad was a carpenter. I think, there are makers in the family. I think it just somehow feels right. But I think sugarcraft is probably the closest to clay that I came to from a very early age, and didn't then pick up clay until I was at college really. I mean, I was always interested in art and making, but clay became more cemented in me, I guess, when I got to college, because I had a very inspirational teacher who was a production potter. And I just remember watching him throw and just thinking, my God, I want to be able to do that. There was nothing profound. It was just, wow. The same reaction anybody has to any maker making something well with a skill, any skill, whatever it is. Part of me thought it might impress the girls if I could do it, which is another thing that adolescent teenagers tend to think about. And I just started playing with clay. I was on a general BTEC at college, general art and design, and my projects slowly began to be turned towards clay. Whatever it was, clay was the outcome. And then I sort of decided to go to Farnham to study ceramics, and that's where it really became a firm part of me, my life really, as a material. It just sort of offered me everything. At Farnham, I initially went to do a BA, and I actually stayed on to do my MA. My dad was always about education. I was one of the first in his family to go to university, a 3D design course, but it was about creating a way of thinking, understand other people and work with other people and live with other people. And I think it was invaluable for that. I mean, certainly the MA, whether it was the right time, I think had I had time out, hindsight's a wonderful thing. If I was looking to go back now, having worked within a commercial sphere with ceramics for a few years now, I would possibly get more or make more of it, certainly. But it doesn't mean to say it wasn't a really useful time, because I think unlike the BA, I was looking towards my career more, so I was thinking more about what I was going to do once I finished. And there was more support in some ways to urge you to have a more holistic approach to your practice, making sure that your practice was not only a skill-based, process-based thing, but it was also a conceptually sustaining thing, so something that you could potentially find interest in for the rest of your life, as opposed to something that was very directed towards a specific project. And I think I certainly found things that sustained me for at least the first 3 or 4 years outside of that environment. The work became more personal as my toolbox of skills became more proficient. I was probably making tiles for 8 years, maybe 10 years before this work started, which was much more personal. And you get to the stage where you're so used to working in the material, you want it to become a language. You want it to use the material as a tool to express your own ideas. And I think I never really understood that concept when I was in the university environment. They were always one thing or the other. And I was actually just making domestic ware, and I was really I loved wood firing, and I still love wood firing. I don't get much opportunity to do it, but I think there wasn't a merging of those two areas. They were always very separate things. So my sketchbook work and my thinking was always outside of my making in many respects. But then my making was always process driven at the time. So actually that was enough. My ideas revolved around process, if that makes sense. But it's only as you start to work with clay longer term, I felt this desire to start exploring the material qualities of the clay and just getting on in life, thinking about having children, and my dad became ill and ideas and priorities change. You start to think about your place in the world and who you are. And it was really when my dad passed away that this work really took hold, I guess, because I started to really think about myself. My wife had just had my daughter. My dad passed away, and I knew a bit about his background, and I guess I just started to... I was more aware about my place in the world and what I wanted for my daughter. And actually, I think as you do when you become a parent yourself, you have a newfound respect for your own parents because you don't necessarily consider them people. And I think, I had this overwhelming respect for what my dad had achieved, considering the sort of background he came from. And so, that sort of really started this whole journey. I was doing a lot of reading around the empire, around migration. The latest work, which is blue and white, that all stemmed from working actually on a fireplace up at the Watts Gallery in Compton in Surrey, and I got given these tiles to recreate, and it was a fireplace that's actually in the studio, in the making studio there, and they said, can you recreate these? The builders have damaged and taken them out, which is inevitable because tiles always get broken. They're early Dutch tiles, and it was only when I started researching the designs that actually there were tiles that were English, that I couldn't pinpoint these designs. Some of them were Southwark, London blue and white. And I just like the idea that something sort of so synonymous with one place, i.e. the Dutch, but it was obviously the Chinese, the Japanese. Everybody was using this colour combination before that, but something that immediately spoke of a particular place. And the connotations of that in terms of the Dutch trading companies, it just somehow felt like it summed up stylistically the sort of experiences I've been having my whole life, but not really kind of necessarily acknowledged, because there was always this immediate assumption that I was of somewhere else or not of this place. And it would usually be the sort of fairly mundane, so where are you from? Which is it's a very direct question to ask someone that you may not know that well, and you'd never consider asking it to anybody other than someone that looks different to you. Essentially, that was all summed up in this one thing that stylistically looked of a place, but actually had so many different homes from all over the world. It was a style that had been copied throughout the world for centuries. When I took Froyle on, my intention really was to use it as a conduit to allow me to make my own work. I was intending to use that to subsidise it and allow me to have the equipment to produce my own work, which to an extent it does. But what I hadn't expected was that it would require a massive input in terms of energy and time, and it would become the sort of main focus of what I do to a degree. It would provide me a livelihood, but equally it would provide me an opportunity to learn an awful lot about the material. I'm going to diversify the business to an extent to incorporate some educational activities, which will hopefully allow me to step out of some of the production and leave me a bit more time for my own work, as well as a sort of a lasting legacy, I think, because I think really education is sort of where it's at. Unless you're passing on any knowledge that you've gained over the years, it becomes useless, really. I think getting involved with a diverse range of activities offers something back as well. Getting out and meeting people when teaching them, you learn. And it's a bit of a cliche to say you always learn more than you ever teach, but actually I think it's true. You do. You just meet people from different backgrounds. I think particularly for makers, where it is a fairly isolated, fairly sort of introverted thing, making your own work, because it has to be. Actually getting out and meeting people is important, however you do that. In terms of selling work, I do that in a number of ways. Up until recently, this year, just because it's been very busy, I would do 2 or 3 shows a year. That would include something like Hatfield. I used to do Art in Action, which was a wonderful event. I also have done previously Ceramic Art London, but I don't do masses of shows purely because it requires a massive amount of work to collect enough stock up to sustain 2 or 3 days selling. Actually, it tends to work far better to supply galleries who require 15, 20 pieces at a time, and then you top them up. And they take a commission, but it's well earned. And actually, when I've actually looked at the figures and look at how much it's cost me to do the shows and how much I've sold and how much I've made, obviously deducting my time, it's actually fairly comparable. They're equally as profitable. Generally, you don't sell so much as quickly because they've got less customers coming in on a daily basis. I mean, a show like Ceramic Art London, I would imagine, would have a couple of thousand visitors a day, if not more, and a gallery would rarely have close to that. But it goes out and you get a cheque at the end of the month, and it trickles back in. So it requires an investment of your own in stock, in the cost of making that stock, but once it's out there, it generally gets sold at some point. The only difficulty is you've got to be very strict about keeping track of stock. It's all too easy to have stock sat in a gallery for long periods of time, and then it becomes almost past your own thinking, so you need to ask for it back to give you the opportunity to sell it elsewhere before it's too far behind your current ideas. But that's the only thing. I'd say that's the only negative thing. Whereas obviously if you're making and selling it yourself, you have sort of better control over what you've got. But I just keep stock sheets, and as things come in, as payments come in, I tick them off the stock sheet, and then I know what I've got where. Unless you're invoicing people regularly, trying to keep track of money and who owes you what and things like that, you never consider it. It's important to leave the decision of who's exhibiting to them, and that comes back to trusting the people who are putting together the shows, because actually, so long as you know that they're going to do a good job, you sort of feel happy to trust that they will. The gallery that has been most successful for me is the Stratford Gallery. They tend to hold work all the time. Howard and Emma there are wonderful. They're ceramics enthusiasts, and ultimately you just need to find the galleries who are passionate about your work, because it is what sells it. And having people that are passionate about ceramics is the next best thing to standing there yourself and extolling the virtues of what you've made. Bills and Rye have always been very good. They're generally independents where the people running them are passionate. And I think in Godalming that's the same situation. They're just passionate people. They're passionate. They're makers. They make, so they get it. They would, in my mind, make the most effective salespeople for anything that I make, really. I've known Margaret and Caroline for a long time, so in a sense our working relationship goes way back. When I was artist in residence at Cranley Art Centre over 15 years ago, I used to make work, and they would hold pop-up exhibitions in a house on the outskirts of Cranley, and they would sell work from the site there during the Artists Open Studios generally. And at one point they invited me to be part of that, and I sent work and sold some pieces there. We've sort of all gone in our own directions, and at that point they didn't have the gallery. I've been all over the place, generally had my head buried in tiles, and they took on the gallery, which funnily enough was in the tile market in Godalming. What was the tile market in Godalming that we used to supply tiles to. And then they asked me whether I'd be interested in exhibiting, and of course, they've got a proven track record, and they're very well established makers in their own right, so I think it's got to be a great environment to be in. And certainly a lot of the social media stuff I've seen looks really great. I think the work they've got is of a high calibre, and I feel privileged to have been asked really to be part of their space. When it comes to price, it's always very difficult, I think, pricing work, because there's a number of considerations, one of which is obviously the amount of labour that goes into it, but then there's always that ambiguous element which comes down to the stage you're at in your career, where the work is, where you feel you're at, where you feel you can price the work and sustain that price. With the tiles, I tend to find it's a very straightforward process, but when it comes to the pots, it's far more difficult because it is so subjective. You're sort of ultimately pricing it at a point where you feel somebody else will accept that that's a realistic price also. It's very easy to undersell yourself. It's very easy to set too high a price. I mean, I think it's just one of those things that comes down to experience and learning, coupled with how long it takes you to make it and the kind of nuts and bolts of the pricing, your actual costs, the firing costs, the cost, certainly in this, the cost of the decals, the cost of the glaze, the cost of the material, the cost of my time. Potters tend to undervalue their labour. I only know that certainly now my time is valuable because I don't have much of it, so I have to price it realistically because otherwise I can't really justify making it. My time is definitely my limiting factor. I've got to the stage now where I've got so many different things coming up 3 months out for the throwdown filming, and that's a quarter of my year. taken up in one activity. Organising the Art in Clay event, that sort of squeezes around everything else in late evenings. Work, this work tends to be 8:30 onwards, weekdays mostly.